Welcome back to the IDRiM podcast and to the first episode of 2026 and the 46th episode overall. On behalf of all at the IDRiM Society, we wish to wish all our listeners a happy new year, and we hope that your year ahead is very pleasant. In 2026, we want to continue to bring to our loyal listeners the newest research and to continue both discussions about ideas, but also for students and members of the public to bring new ideas to them from the disaster field. Today, we're speaking to Shalini of Northeastern University in Boston about her research titled Empowering Communities, a Bottom-Up Approach to Disaster Risk Reduction. So welcome, Shalini.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you today?
Good. It's a cold day in Boston.
Yeah, I can imagine, because we're recording this in December, and Boston is renowned for being chilly at this time of the year.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's keeping its character for sure.
Okay, so I'm going to start with a question I like to start with all my guests.
Okay.
What motivated you to write this paper, and why did you specifically focus on the bottom-up approach to disaster risk reduction?
I think what really motivated this paper was the growing sort of realization that, there's this, despite decades of like investment in highly technical sort of top-down disaster systems, communities are still really encountering major gaps in preparedness and recovery. So if we look at the last decade, from Japan's Noto Peninsula earthquake to things like California wildfires that we saw in 2024 and throughout 2025, we see that disasters are becoming more complex and more frequent. And yet there's the institutional approach hasn't really evolved at the same pace. So top-down disaster risk reduction still tends to be treating the communities as like a passive recipient rather than partners. And during my field work and my co-authors, Daniel Aldrich and Michio Ikiwatari, we kept on sort of encountering sort of this disconnect. On paper, governments talk about community engagement, but at the ground level, we did not see this happening. So the big motivation was to really capture what the experts had to say before going into the ground level, which we are doing right now. So the people working every day in disaster risk reduction in both the US and Japan, which are both very highly disaster-prone nations, actually talk about this approach at the expert level. So we decided to conduct interviews because we wanted a grounded perspective on how bottom-up DRR is really being, I guess, implemented, and then what the limitations are and how it could be basically strengthened. So in many ways, I guess this paper kind of touch both on the things that exist today, but at the same time, the critique and also maybe call for action, something along the lines of those. So I would say, to sort of talk about the big picture and what the motivation was, I think that's it.
Yeah, and I think that most countries are guilty for this top-down government approach rather than involving the community from the bottom up. I know of it here in the UK.
Yeah.
It says it's community-led, but in a lot of cases it's still this top-down approach. So your study, particularly as you mentioned, draws on interviews from from experts in both the United States and in Japan. What made these two countries such a compelling case for the comparison and not other countries?
Why US and Japan is a very interesting question. As I said earlier, US and Japan are, in the best way possible, one of the two biggest countries that in the very near history that are global north wealthy countries that have been experiencing higher levels of disasters. They provide a very incredibly rich comparative landscape because one, they're both technologically super advanced. Maybe US is not as advanced as Japan just because it's, the geographical size wise, it's much bigger. But they're both high income countries that are facing extreme and frequent disasters. But their governance structures and cultures are super different. So this gives us sort of a leeway into understanding how different, similar levels of development, but different governance structures sort of act in a similar situation of what we call a disaster, right? So Japan is known for its, I guess, strong centralized disaster management structure. So they have a national framework, highly standardized system with a very long history of state-led resilience efforts, from things like seawalls to hazard mapping. But at the same time, they have cultural traditions of community participation. This was initially seen in this, I guess, structure called machitsukuri, which kind of translate to Machi meaning town, tsukuri meaning creation, so town creation. It was run by a neighborhood association in areas that faced disasters. So you have this type of like interesting tensions between centralized and society-led DR approaches in Japan. On the other hand, we have the US case, which is very decentralized. States and municipalities have significant autonomy, even though there's organizations like FEMA that provides monetary funds at the top level. They also have NGOs that play a huge role to fill in the governance gaps. The actual implementation really varies wildly across communities. So that's what you see in the case of US. This kind of creates, I would say, a rich variation on how bottom-up and top-down approaches works within the US as well. So even within these two sort of stories that I gave you, I feel like there's like a big difference between the two countries. But another reason these, I would say, countries are compelling is that both have faced I want to say we call it stress tests that kind of revealed the weaknesses in their disaster risk reduction system. So to give a quick example, in the US, Hurricane Katrina and other, hurricanes that have happened subsequently kind of exposed issues like bureaucratic fragmentation, inequitable recovery, and lack of trust between residents and institution. In Japan, after 311, the Great East earthquake in Japan, also revealed how, centralized systems can kind of fall short when local input is missing, especially around things like evacuation planning, insurance systems, and reconstruction priorities. So both countries, to kind of summarize, have a tokenistic sort of community engagement, where local voices are included symbolically, but not actually substantively. And both have resource inequalities that hinder certain type of groups, more in US, less in Japan, but they both have those. Both also rely heavily on this concept of social capital, which is trust, networks, community during disasters, even though institutions don't, always acknowledge its importance formally. So comparing them, I don't want to say it wasn't just about contrast. It was also about identifying, I guess, shared challenges and opportunities for maybe hybrid models for disaster risk reduction. But yeah.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking of this, and I was looking at the questions I had prepared for this. So you've talked about, these differences. What was the most, surprising similarities between both the US and Japan in their DRR practices?
So I think what surprised me the most is that although the US and Japan have, fundamentally I want to say, different governance cultures, they share remarkably similar challenges when it comes to making, disaster risk reduction truly like community centered. So one, I want to say, big similarity was the persistence of tokenism, as I just said. In both countries, governments, I think, tend to hold things like public meetings, consultations, or they call them listening sessions in the US. But experts told us that these often functions more like symbolic acts than like really genuine opportunities for people to influence the government. So residents are invited to come in, but like final decision at the end of the day that includes things like infrastructure planning, funding, land use, how relocation should be done are usually made by technical experts or like political leaders, which are, at the higher income pay level. So like people don't at the end of the day get a say. Um, Another shared theme was the undervaluing of local knowledge. Both system acknowledge, at least rhetorically, that communities hold, like kind of critical insights to the ecosystem, cultural practices, and then social networks as well. But in practice, this knowledge kind of not used in the decision making. A third similarity I would say was, I think it was like the structural inequality that particularly the lower income residents in the US, or the disabled communities in Japan, or the marginalized communities in places like Baton Rouge, Louisiana, was facing during the recovery period. In the US, you have cost sharing requirements, and then you also have like uneven access to nonprofit support that basically create these disparities. In Japan, you know, experts talked about how survivors of the 3/11 talked about this idea of double loans, um, low insurance penetration, and then also standardized like recovery system that don't really fit the local realities, right? Double loans would meaning that you would have a loan for your existing house that get destroyed, and then you have to pay for another loan to get relocated or build the house on the destroyed house. So in both contexts, experts really agreed that disaster recovery can unintentionally, widen the existing inequalities or social gaps. And I think one of the other, I would say, like similarities between the two countries is, I think social capital existed, and people really relied heavily on them. Even if they were not formally integrated into the policy, they still existed. Whether it's a neighborhood association in Japan or a grassroots and NPO in the US, people consistently kind of turned the trusted networks, like turned to them first during crisis before actually looking for like formal institutional support, or like mobilize with the neighborhood first before looking into what would the government provide for us during this situation. So I think these similarities kind of highlight that despite kind of different starting points, both countries are in a way grappling with the same sort of fundamental question: how do we build systems that genuinely empower communities rather than kind of merely, I guess, consulting them? Would be, yeah, is this something that came out of this study?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack what you've mentioned. So I'm going to
Yeah.
start off with the tokenism bit. And this is
Mhm.
actually something that I did notice come out as a big, point when I was reading your paper.
Yeah.
And it seemed to come up quite a lot in your interviews. In particular, I noticed it came up a lot on Louisiana's case study. And you
Mhm.
mentioned about St. Bernard Parish residents felt excluded from any decision making that was, taken back in 2005. Why do you think tokenism persists, and how can institutions overcome it, do you think?
Yeah. I believe, at least through the findings of this paper, tokenism, I think, persists because I think at its core, it's the easiest way for institutions to signal participation without actually shifting power. This is really sad if you think about it. A lot of agencies are required to consult the public. It's written on, it's codified policies that talks about consulting the public, but they are not necessarily required to, like share decision-making authority with them. So you end up with a meeting where the community actually come and speak, but the direction to the project has already been kind of determined. So this is like it's the second thought of the authorities to just like bring up to tick a box instead of actually, getting these people's opinions. So in the interviews specifically talk about, because the interviews are the reason why we sort of found these generalized findings. The experts kind of described, several reasons for this sort of situation. First, they said there's this idea of technical dominance, right? So there's engineers, planners, bureaucrats who have the political power that often believe they have the most objective, the most rational solutions. This kind of makes them skeptical of community input, which they, I think, kind of preserve um, um, as emotional or sort of unscientific coming from the community itself. Second, I think there's this concept of political risk that we talk about, which is, kind of like sharing power means sharing accountability. And institutions can be kind of like hesitant to, I guess, open themselves into the criticism that might come after completing a project with community input. And I think there's also, the structural inertia. The top-down systems were designed decades ago and are deeply embedded in, they call law, funding, administrative, bureaucratic rigidity, so to speak. So even when there's a desire to change, the mechanism to do so doesn't really exist. In Japan, for example, post-disaster committees often include local representatives, but final decisions still, follow through centralized agencies. In the US, experts kind of talk about community members feeling, de-enfranchised or exhausted by the process that appears kind of inclusive, but are ultimately, predetermined. Here's you also asked how to overcome this. Pretty impossible if you ask me, especially, like talking about two big and very centralized structured countries. But there's hope always within the changing structures of disastrous reduction. I think one powerful solution is independent facilitation. So one expert in, I think, New Orleans emphasized that engagement sessions work best when moderated by someone outside of the government, so not beholden to the political interest. So this increases kind of trust and reduces perceptions of manipulation. Another thing could be co-design, which is one of the policy findings of the paper, which goes beyond consultations. I think, by making community partners just not just in shaping agendas, but also in like developing criteria and also maybe evaluating proposals that already exist within the authorities. So co-design kind of embeds the community influence throughout the entire project lifecycle instead of just hearing their, ideas in the beginning. And then we also have like transparent funding paths that we discuss in our paper that kind of allows communities not just the governments, to access resources that can, shift the maybe like the power dynamic. So if local leaders, NPOs, and resident groups can apply for these and manage funding, I think they hold a real influence. This is not a part of obviously this paper, but I just did a sort of a disaster risk reduction, same size type of structure of interviews in Australia. And I saw this actually thriving there in Victoria and New South Wales, very rural areas in the two regions. But this structure was thriving already because they've given access to nonprofit organizations to handle the fundings for the residents of the area. So to just like kind of, like get all of those things into just like one, conclusion, I would say tokenism presses because it's easy. That's the best way for, I guess, big authorities to handle their development plans. But as our, interviewees made it clear, genuine collaboration is not impossible. It's just a matter of making it equitable, trusted, and effective for the DRR system.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree, and it's not a surprise to hear that type of thing. I also found that it's not. What I found was that even when it came to research, there's that element of tokenism as well, where young researchers not having a voice. I'm noticing it's changing as well. That is now changing, and I think that's a show that there are changes going on. Because I remember, and this is a story I've told my students. I remember I was at a conference, a UN conference, actually in 2016, and there was talk about developing a youth network, and they're like, and they wanted the youth there, but then there was one senior professor, and I think he was from Italy, so said, "I've heard all this before. What's it gonna do?" You know what I mean? Like, it's good
Exactly.
you're here, but but this stay over there type of approach. And now I know that UNDRR do have a youth network. They have set it up. So even the UN recognize that tokenism is an issue, and they are trying to make small but steady changes to get rid of that. So it's not just inside these communities; it's actually inside the research community. It's been for a long time, but the research community finally acknowledges that as well. So going on to you said about funding, and I also noticed on one of the previous comments about Japan and this double loan system. And you notice that there seems to be an issue, especially with these standardized systems such as earthquake insurance that don't match local realities. What reforms do you think are needed then? Because insurance issue seems to come up everywhere. I know I've heard of problems in Australia. I've heard problems in the US, even here in the UK, of insurance not meeting the reality of what is actually happening.
Funny enough, we're right now doing a paper on comparative insurance between state, market, and community, we call it, between US and Japan. So I might have a lot more to say in the future, but based on what we found / when we were doing this paper, I think Japan's earthquake insurance system is a very good textbook example of like how top-down standardized frameworks can kind of inadvertently, create hardships during recovery for people. So experts in our study kind of described the system as a very blunt to capture the complexity of local, damage. So right now, damage categories are really limited to 4 very broad classifications, and the payouts are standardized costs, kind of across like large administrative areas, basically. But disasters don't always, impact communities in the standardized way. So that's like the funniest thing about this. Why is there's a standard when you're not sure about the level of impact a disaster could have on a certain community? Just to talk about going back to the example of 3/11, because that's the biggest earthquake / disaster that Japan has ever faced. Many of the survivors received very insufficient compensation because their damage classification didn't, like reflect the nuanced realities of how their homes were impacted. And because, private insurance penetration is relatively low, families found themselves in what expert in our study called double loan situations, still pay mortgage on their destroyed, houses, homes, while also taking out new loans to rebuild. So this was a major burden. And knowing that Japan has, second largest aging or elderly population in the world, this just gives these elderly population or residents extra burden in their later parts of life. Um, you also asked like, well, what reforms are needed? I mean, so many things if we were to just go on about it. But I think just to mention a couple, the first need to be a more granular risk assessment structure, right? So instead of a prefecture-wide category. So in Japan, you have prefectures instead of states. Insurance models maybe should reflect neighborhood level variations and maybe the specific vulnerabilities of each area. This could include using community level hazard mapping or integrating local input of like post disasters into the assessment criteria, right? Another thing could be flexible payout structures. So rather than a rigid category, payouts maybe could be tied to actual rebuilding needs, um, go to the threshold of the local damages. This would kind of allow more tailored and equitable recovery instead of just giving, let's say, $1,000 to any house. Because think about it, one house could be fully destroyed, which then need $10,000, whereas another house could be just partially, like destroyed. Maybe their garden is destroyed and they might only need 1,000. But giving everybody the same amount of money is not going to fix the problem. So you need to have more flexible payout in that sense. A third thing can be integrating, again, community voices, because this is something we, of course, is encouraging in our paper. Instead of the state deciding what to give, what recovery looks like for the community. And finally, the last thing could be expanding affordability and access. So we need to understand that the idea of insurance um, is, I think, vaguely defined in the world, that people think when I apply for insurance, I immediately get it back. That's not how it works. It's going to take years and years. In some cases, people don't get insurance back for like 10 years. So basically, to say that insurance uptake could take a long time, but also insurance uptake could be improved by, subsidizing coverage for vulnerable populations first, or by integrating earthquake insurance into like the broader DRR packages that, include preparedness support. So I think overall, looking at the Japan case, our experts argued that Japan does not need to abandon its centralized system, but they simply need to make space for flexibility and equity. So this one size fit all approach is efficient, I think, on paper, but not in practice. So it fails people that are meant to be protected. So there needs to be changes in the overall structure so people can actually post-disaster recover faster compared to the current structure.
Yeah, and one of the things that I found fascinating when you were just talking then, it just came to me about, some issues that we have here. You mentioned, about, these double loans where they have one for the new home. And I remember you mentioning sometimes being built on top of the old home. And you mentioned also the issue of affordability. In Japan, if you're rebuilding, you're getting, these loans, is the loan quote higher after they've had, after when they start rebuilding, is it more expensive for them to take out this new loan because of they've already had to claim previously, or is it still the original cost?
I think it depends quite a lot on area to area. We're currently doing interviews in Noto Peninsula, which had a earthquake, a very large one actually, um, 1st January 2024, I believe. Like on New Year's Day, people were supposed to like have a relaxed day, but boom, they were hit with a tsunami and an earthquake, destroyed their homes. Most people in, again, thinking about Japan and the sort of the stereotypical picture you have, image you have of Japan is that it's a very fast recovery country, right? I visited Noto Peninsula uh, summer this year, and there's still people living in evacuation centers in the tents and stuff like that because they're waiting for payout for insurances. But usually they have to get larger mortgages, basically, so to speak, to build on the same areas. One, because those areas will be recorded as high risk areas now that there has been a disaster there. So the government highly recommend people to not build there. So building there means you have to get extra approval from like your municipalities, your prefectural government, which leads to then like higher level of mortgages. Um, when talking about like double loans, I think your initial loan that you use to build your house is going to be way cheaper than your second loan because now you're not just going to have the trouble of like going through the structure of getting permit to build in the same location. You're also going to have the issue of developers, right? Like, because everybody's going to want to build, and developers' prices are going to go up. So, so far from what we've seen, the people who are staying still at the evacuation center are those who are very emotionally attached to their home in Noto as well. So one, they don't want to move out. Two, they're just basically waiting on funding to rebuild. But to just simply answer the question, they're just going to have to pay more. Um, and the insurance payout from their initial house is not enough. So again, they end up in the double loan situation, and it's quite sad to see that. And these are Noto Peninsula compared to areas like Tokyo, or like like the prefecture of Tokyo, prefecture of Osaka, prefecture of Nagoya has a higher number of elderly population because these are not city center areas, right? So you're basically seeing 80-year-olds taking loans to rebuild houses. So it's quite saddening to really even think about.
Yeah, so the reason I ask is that in the UK, if
Yeah.
you've been flooded about 3 times, no insurance company will touch you. And there is no law to say that the insurance company have to cover you. Or if it is insurance, you're going to be paying. I've seen quotes of over $10,000 a year just for insurance, which is like a tenth of the value of the entire property. So it becomes the
Yeah.
question: how do you afford it? So in the UK, only 4 in 10 households
Mm,
have insurance. So because people, it's not affordable. So this is why I bring the insurance question in, because it's
mm,
an issue that seems to affect a lot of countries, and no one has any ideas on how to make
mm,
insurance more accessible, and it just creates that divide
yeah.
between the communities even greater.
Mm. No, for sure.
So I wanted to move on to the methodology now, and a
Mm,
little bit. And we've already mentioned that you've picked between Japan and the US. Now you conducted 15 in-depth interviews between the two countries. How were these participants, chosen to ensure that there was
mm,
methodological rigor?
mm. So we used an what we call in methods exploratory qualitative approach because we wanted to basically understand not just what policies exist, but how experts working inside the system kind of perceive the strengths and limitations of the current disaster risk reduction practices. Participants were selected basically using snowball sampling, starting with well-established DR practitioners and researchers who then referred us to like their network. This approach was basically ideal for reaching people in specialized, really hard to access fields, which is like, local governments, nonprofit directors, policy experts, architects, resilient planners, and then basically members of the national agencies. To ensure rigor, we basically structured the methodological process in like a couple of key ways. So first, diversity of expert was very important to us. We intentionally included experts from different sectors, which is, varying between government, civil society, academia, and private practice. So they would, give us a varied perspective instead of people from government saying we're doing a good job, right? And then we had the language accessibility. So interviews in the US were conducted fully in English and Spanish. But we had a translator for like the Spanish ones. And then the second one was the Japan ones were fully in Japanese. The Japanese interviews were, translated carefully into English because all three of our researchers speak Japanese, but we have a specific Japanese person who speaks fluent English. Because concepts like Machisukuri or Fukuinkai are like very difficult conceptual ideas. So we wanted that sort of contextual accuracy. And we did have 25 interviews at the beginning, but we had to cut down really to focus mainly on this topic because the other 10 participants really kind of went on to talking about other concepts because these are semi-structured interviews, right? We could ask a couple of questions, but they could take it into a completely different directions, then does not serve the purpose of our study. Which is in a way sad. It would be nice to, talk a little bit more about like gentrification and stuff like that, which were captured a lot in those other interviews that we did not include in the study. But in the 15 interviews that we did use, we basically used a systematic coding structure. We used the software called NVivo for data analysis, applying both sort of inductive and deductive coding structures. So in the inductive coding allowed us to basically build themes naturally. So basically emerged themes, we call them, from interviews, while the deductive coding then used to, I guess, predefine the categories. So categories like the community-based DRR, decentralization, and social capital. And then the other thing that was really important to us was ethical safeguarding. The study underwent, proper IRB approval at Northeastern University. We, anonymized organizational affiliations to protect sensitive positions and ensure, participants could speak freely because they were, in a way, talking about like the how bad the government structures are. So sort of this, I guess, like overall, this combination of methodological rigor and ethical care kind of helped us ensure that the findings, one, they're robust, they're credible, but they're also at the same time reflective of like the real world experiences, rather than kind of in a way abstract theories. But then again, the goal is to go beyond from here and actually speak to the communities that are facing. So that's like our sort of next step. Now that we've understood what the experts think, the next step hopefully will be, talking to the communities.
Right. So any plans to use the other 10 interviews, or are those just...
We are using it for a gentrification study. So initially, this is like a little bit of a fun fact, I think, for a podcast too, if like, students get to hear about this, that would be really fun. Initially, when we wrote the paper, we did include the concept of gentrification. But after, sending it around to just before submitting it to journals, sending it to a couple of senior scholars to review it, they said it just takes away the bottom-up approach out of the paper and focus, like there's too many concepts going on in the paper. So after those like reviews from senior scholars, we decided to take away the gentrification bit and focused more on bottom-up DRR. But right now what we're doing is interviews in Louisiana, basically, because there is a lot of gentrification out there because of Hurricane Katrina. And to then use those interviews with that new set of interviews to see what the concept of gentrification is doing to communities after disaster. So a little bit of different concept, but similarly, we'll, I think, touch up on how communities help each other.
Yeah, and I think for that it's actually good for students to hear that, the behind the scenes bit, because I think too often, especially for PhD students who are just starting, they get this theory, idea that their first paper, if it's failed, they're failed. It's not. There's always reasons. I've had plenty of papers that failed for trying to pack too much in, and sometimes simpler actually, is more better.
No, for sure.
So, you've mentioned a number of times now, I've heard about, expanding this, what you've done so far. So you mentioned that you're doing more about in Louisiana, gentrification, you're doing you've talked about New South Wales and Victoria as well, where you've now expanded this concept, see what's going on over there. Is that the scope, or are you going to be expanding any further into other countries and regions?
So Louisiana is going to be focused basically on the concept of gentrification, because that's a big thing that's happening there, especially with more lower income people. It's, I think, the second lowest income state in the United States. Do not super quote me on this. I've recently read an article on it, but I haven't delved deep into the literature on that. But so we're focusing on gentrification there, but I'm focusing on, I just did my field work in Australia. I was there for about a month. And I basically did a study on bushfire and flood. Well, evacuees and also basically people who faced bushfires and floods, and then either moved out of those areas or either moved back into the community, and what that process looked like for both of them, right? So starting from what happened during the disaster, what did the recovery process look like, what did the long-term recovery for them, their communities look like, and what does the government support look like for them. So I did about in person, I did about 23 interviews within a month. And online, I was able to do 15 more interviews, and I have 10 more. So altogether, I'll have about like 45 interviews. The goal was to do N30. So 30 interviews were like the max that I was going to do. But this paper specifically focused on this new concept of like climate migration, right? How people move between place to place, or why people decide to adapt within, even after like a huge disaster like Black Summer bushfires in Australia. What I found at the end of the day, I still haven't started analyzing the interviews yet, but just like some initial themes that popped up was social capital. People just really, really love the areas that they live. They trust their networks and their communities that help them rebuild their life there. So they just decided to stay, which is like a really interesting initial sort of theme. But it's lovely to see social capital popping up completely in another side of the world as well. But that's the second one that we're working on right now. And then the third paper is comparative insurance between state market, which is private, and then community, which is at the municipality level, which is a little bit separated from the centralized structure. Insurances, just because insurance is another concept that keeps on popping up. The same research team that worked on this paper is working on that right now, but we want that to be more data heavy, and it's going to be a little bit more quantitative as well, with obviously more control variables. So do not love to always quantify work, just because it really takes away, I think, like the things that we talk about in this paper, for example, right? But at the end of the day, like statistics do give us some idea into what's happening in the world in a more generalized manner, so that we could actually reach then municipalities and governments to ask for action. So we're working on really a number of papers that look at the same concept of disaster risk reduction, but in several different ways right now.
Yeah, so that is really fascinating to hear, and it's, in fact, we might bite you back on later on to talk about some of these. So there were a couple of little things that I reflected upon when I was reading your paper, and I'm just going to pick, two of these issues here now. And one of the things that I keep, we hear is that bottom approaches are often praised in principle, but difficult in practice. And you've mentioned this. But what are the biggest misconceptions practitioners or policymakers still make and still have about these community-based DRR projects?
I think one of the big misconceptions is that community involvement will, I guess, slow down decision making. Because policymakers often assume that engaging people at the ground, residents, right? Like any one of us will complicate timelines or introduce, I guess, like bigger disagreements than they already have. But what our interviews kind of, highlighted is the opposite is often true. When communities trust the process and kind of, help shape the plan from the beginning, implementation actually goes much more smoothly because there's buy-in. So resistance kind of arises, I think, when people feel unheard, and not when they're actually meaningfully involved. So this is like a big misconception that I think exists in the current society as well as in the literature, I think, because I've seen papers talking about how communities are gonna, make the timeline longer and mess things up, kind of, very sort of bad generalizations, really. And I think another misconception is that communities lack technical expertise that is needed to contribute to disaster risk reduction. So policymakers tend to think that things like this, right? Residents don't understand systemic engineering, or they don't know how mitigation funding really works. But what communities brings is, I think, different kind of expertise, right? So they have place-based knowledge. They know where they live the best. That is basically impossible for outsiders to just like come and replicate. And they also know evacuation, bottlenecks, informal networks of care, and then historic flood patterns that they might not even know. Because these small floods, sometimes people don't even get registered at the state level. It just don't reach beyond municipalities, right? And they also do not know cultural significance of sites, and then vulnerabilities of elderly or the disabled neighbors, right? So there's sort of that on-ground knowledge. And then the other misconception that really exists is that maybe community-based models can be scaled, I guess, nationally, right? The bottom-up approaches, I think, need to be more context specific. When I talked about the Machitsukuri style process in Japan, it can't be simply copied and copy paste in Louisiana, because it's very different cultures in both countries, right? But policymakers sometimes treat community-based disaster risk reduction as a toolkit, something you can deploy universally. So you need to kind of like stop thinking that way. It's really more of a philosophy of empowerment that needs to be tailored to the culture, the governance structure, and the social fabric of each place. Because Majid Tsukuri that happened in, let's say, Aichi Prefecture, Japan, which is, I used to live there, for example, for like 5 years of my life. Very different from what can be happen in Boston, Massachusetts. I live completely two different lives. My social fabric is completely different, right? I knew my neighbor in Aichi Prefecture. I do not know my neighbor in Boston, Massachusetts. So like there's a big difference, right? They're both cities. They're both very equally developed cities, but they work differently. I think the last thing I wanted to mention was resource burden. I think policymakers tend to think that community-based disaster risk reduction is cheaper because communities do the work, right? But bottom-up approaches requires, I think, steady investment as well in social infrastructure where people can actually gather and make decisions, and then facilitation and maybe local leadership development to actually hold it together, right? Without funding, without crucial financial support, these structures basically again become symbolic rather than substantive. So in short, I think the biggest misconception of it all is that policymakers tend to confuse participation with like power, and they think through community-based DRR is basically asking communities to input um, without really giving them any authority to do what should be happen within their communities. But yeah.
Yeah, so the last question on the reflection was your research touched upon equality issues, especially for disabled communities, low income residents, and marginalized groups. How can DRR systems avoid reinforcing these existing inequalities? We've already mentioned about, those who are particularly, if they have to take insurance, then, usually it's the poorest that are going to be kept poor because of it. What can we do to stop these types of reinforcement issues?
Mm. Um,
Is there anything we could do?
yeah, great question. Um, I think one of the clearest findings from the interviews, just like going back into like what we really found in the paper, is that disasters themselves, I guess, don't like create inequality. They basically just like expose and amplify inequalities that already exist in the society, really, right? It's when a disaster hits, the rich person, a richer, wealthier person, not that it's their fault, could easily adapt and like find their way back into their original situation. But it's not the same for middle and low income people that already have vulnerabilities, right? Being vulnerable in a society, like in different societies today. To talk about, because you mentioned disabled communities, Japanese experts kind of emphasized this like huge gap they have in like welfare evacuation shelters for disabled communities, where they had not very good enough trained staff, meaning disabled residents need to rely on like family members or basically assist themselves, right? So trust-based networks with like local disability organizations like the Japan's DPI structure were shown to be basically very essential, but they're always excluded from like the official planning committees. So at the end of the day, the disaster risk reduction system should build formal partnership with organizations like this. For example, in this case, they should connect with disability advocates to ensure that this type of shelters are included in evacuation plans. So moving on from disabled communities, talking about the lower income communities, especially in the US, I think funding mechanisms can be major source of inequality. So in the US, there's, I think, cost share requirements where communities have to contribute 25% of the project costs. So automatically that puts lower income communities in disadvantage. I remember one of the experts kind of noting that while like volunteer hours can count towards a match, this kind of still leaves like very poor communities caught between high vulnerability and then like low capacity to meet like funding criterias, right? So equitable DRR, I think, really requires like a rewriting of these rules that exist in both countries, really. So for marginalized racial and ethnic communities, especially again in both Japan and US, cultural belongings also play a huge role. One of the experts described a neighborhood market that served as a critical community anchor, removing, it in the name of resilience would have basically displaced cultural identity, not just like the commerce bit of it. So DR planning, I think, should treat cultural, continuity as an asset, not as an obstacle. Um, I think I wanted to also mention meaningful equity kind of work really requires inclusive data. So like the standardized metrics are not always going to kind of like reflect what lived realities for at-risk populations are going to look like. So including things like what we do, like qualitative feedback from marginalized communities will then ensure um, that like the DRR systems are recognizing vulnerabilities as a multidimensional thing, not just as like a economic like point that they need to care about. So it's more social, cultural, and physical in the case of disabled communities, and then also historical, because people do have so much more connection to these areas. But I think overall equity like is not a side issue in DRR, right? I do not like when people just put equality into the sidelines and just focus on like the disasters as like, oh, this is just the environmental thing that we need to focus on. It is really like the foundation of resilience. So without equality for everybody, but maybe more so for the people who are more at risk and vulnerable, recovery really becomes uneven, and like trust, erodes, and you could really leave behind a big population in this scenario. So you gotta start thinking from bottom up is like really I would say, the lesson here.
And actually, that comes on to my final question for
Mhm.
this interview: is that what one message you hope policymakers or practitioners will take from your study?
Mm. Um, yeah, writing the conclusion was the hardest part. As always, in any paper, I'm like, what would I want anyone to take out from it? I think if there's one message, I hope uh, it's this like top-down systematic structures cannot achieve resilience alone. Like just that, right? Like just my advertisement for this paper would be that. So no amount of like engineering or like centralized planning can really substitute like what the power of local knowledge, social networks, and community leadership would bring. So, you know, bottom-up disaster risk reduction is not it's not a philosophical ideal, it's a practical necessities. I think our interviewees made it very, very clear what communities are genuinely, when communities are genuinely empowered, which I really see in, um, Louisiana, Vietnamese communities coming together, building back better and faster than any other community who faced Hurricane Katrina is one of the best examples, I think. When they're empowered, they produce solutions that are more sustainable, more culturally relevant, and more widely trusted, right? So when communities are excluded and maybe like only involved in like a smaller portion, or maybe like just like symbolically, the recovery is super slow. So resilience is it's a kind of fundamentally relational if you think about it. It grows, everyday intersections. Daniel Aldrich, my advisor, as well as one of the big names that would come out in the concept of social capital, talks about how, parks, schools, um, libraries, religious institutions, or neighborhood associations are places where people build trust long before disaster strikes. So policymakers need to start investing not only on physical infrastructure that are like levees, dams, and seawalls and stuff like that, but also in social infrastructure and the processes that allow communities to kind of voice their concerns now. So the outcome later when a disaster hits is mitigation early on and not like recovery after the process, right? So ultimately, I think the future of disaster risk reduction depends on, moving beyond consultation towards, I think, more like through like collaboration, right? Where communities are not just like heard, as I said, and they're truly involved in the process. But I think I want to say that that type of shift requires like institution humility, flexibility, and willingness to see communities as like co-creators and not as clients, right? So if we are able to, which we are, I think, in the current process of doing, to make this shift, we can build disaster systems or resilient systems, so to speak, that are not only more effective, but also, just there's all in all that would in an ideal world, ideal society, that would be the real, like heart of resilience. But yeah, I think the world is moving towards that direction, and the governments in Japan and US, the two countries that I talked about in this paper, are moving towards that direction. So there's hope, there's positivity in that. So to end on a good note.
I was just saying, what a great way to end this episode of the podcast. And thank you for spending a very cold, I hear, Thursday recording this episode. And I'd like to also thank the audience for listening. And we'll hope to see you all very soon.